Every man, woman, and child in Norway is currently sitting on about 4 million Norwegian kroner, or around $420,000 each. The only thing is, almost none of them will ever touch a single krona of it, and that's by design. Now, whenever Norway's wealth comes up, most people assume it all comes from Norway's oil. But in actuality, it's Norway's sovereign wealth fund that has turned that oil money into lasting wealth. Last year, Norway's sovereign wealth fund posted a profit of $247 billion on a 15% return, and in the first half of 2026, it made another $184 billion. That's far more money than the North Sea has handed the Norwegian state in a very long time. The oil, at this point, is beside the point. But every country that ever really struck big in natural resources got roughly the same opportunity that Norway got, and almost all of them blew it. So, how did Norway pull this off? Well, today we break down how and why Norway built a sovereign wealth fund it legally isn't allowed to spend, what the $2.3 trillion fund owns on its citizens' behalf, and the risk the CEO says he is forbidden from hedging, and how that could spell trouble for Norway's future. My name is Nick, and this is the Finance Bureau. Now, let's start with the common assumption most people have about Norway's wealth, because it's not exactly wrong, it's just incomplete. Norway is a petroleum state. According to the Norwegian Offshore Directorate, the country produced 239 million standard cubic meters of oil equivalent in 2025, and output is running at around 4.1 million barrels of oil equivalent per day through 2026. Norwegian gas covers roughly 30% of total EU demand, with the troll field alone accounting for about a third of national gas output. With oil and gas prices where they are these days, Norway's population of 5.5 million people are sitting on one of the most valuable hydrocarbon endowments per head anywhere on Earth. But there's more to it than that, because Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and it produced a collapsed currency and a shattered state oil company instead of a trust fund. Nigeria has pumped crude out of the Niger Delta for over half a century and has almost nothing institutional to show for it. Oil doesn't just make a country wealthy and great for its citizens, so what did Norway do differently? Well, the decisive move happened in 1990, 6 years before there was any money to move. On the 22nd of June that year, the Norwegian Parliament passed the Government Petroleum Fund Act, later renamed the Government Pension Fund Global. It created an account with nothing in it. The first actual deposit didn't arrive until the 30th of May 1996. And it was a 1.98 billion kroner, which is somewhere around $300 million, which for a national savings vehicle isn't a whole lot. Now, the reason Norway built this thing before they needed it comes down to a phenomenon called the Dutch disease, which, in case you're not familiar, is what can happen when a country suddenly gets much richer from a natural resource like oil. The export earnings push the currency up, domestic costs inflate, and every industry that isn't the resource, manufacturing, engineering, anything that has to compete internationally, gets priced out of existence. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the windfall arrives, and it ends up hollowing out everything around it. So, Norway's answer to this was a rule that, on the face of it, can sound a bit self-defeating. The money is banned from being invested inside Norway. All of it goes abroad. So, Norway discovered an enormous fortune under its seabed, and then made it illegal to spend that fortune on itself. And that restriction is why the krona never ate the rest of the Norwegian economy. Which brings us to the second rule. In 2001, Norway adopted what's known domestically as the handlingsregelen, the fiscal rule. The government may spend the expected real return of the fund and nothing more. And that means the government can't ever spend the principal. It was introduced at 4%, and then in February 2017, under the Solberg Agreement, it was tightened to 3% on the recommendation of an expert committee that concluded future real returns would be lower than the ones assumed 16 years earlier. So the Norwegian government voluntarily cut its own allowance by a quarter on the advice of a committee in order to protect money it would never personally get credit for spending. Kind of difficult to comprehend in the world we're living in today, but in any case, that's the Norwegian fiscal story in a nutshell. And what's more, in practice, the rule is seen as a ceiling instead of a target. In the 2026 national budget, transfers from the fund are estimated at 579 billion kroner, which works out at roughly 2.8% of the fund value, comfortably underneath the cap. What that 579 billion kroner buys is Norway's non-oil structural budget deficit. And that means the returns pay for the gap between what the Norwegian state collects in ordinary tax and what it spends, which means Norway funds its public services without issuing debt to do it. And that means that the returns pay for the gap between what the Norwegian state collects in ordinary tax and what it spends, which means Norway funds its public services without issuing any debt to do it. And the fund now covers roughly a quarter of the entire state budget, up from roughly a tenth a decade ago. CEO Nicolai Tengen has presented that quarter as being worth, and I quote, Norway's spending on all its hospitals, the entire national insurance system, transport, higher education, and research combined. End quote. NBIM, standing for Norway Bank Investment Management, is the arm of Norway's central bank that manages the fund. It now says that more than half of the fund's total value comes from investment returns rather than the petroleum deposits. And the scale is something else. As of mid-2026, the fund stands at roughly 22.6 trillion kroners, which is about $2.3 trillion. The allocation is 72.1% equities, 25.8% fixed income, 1.7% unlisted real estate, and 0.4% renewable infrastructure. And that equity part is spread across more than 7,000 companies in over 6 countries, which works out at roughly 1.5% of every listed company on Earth and about 3% of those listed in Europe. Norway owns about 1.3% of Nvidia, a stake NBIM disclosed at around $61.8 billion, and Nvidia's market capitalization has only gone up since, now sitting at $5.45 trillion. It owns roughly 1.2% of Apple, about 1.3% of Microsoft, and around 1% of Tesla. Alphabet is now the fund's third largest holding at roughly 1.17%, or something near $50 billion. And in the August half-year report, NBIM disclosed a stake in SpaceX for the first time, a roughly 0.05% valued at $1.22 billion as of the 30th of June. It's kind of bizarre, but Norway is a top-tier shareholder in the American technology boom. And it's not totally passive about it either, because NBIM voted against Elon Musk's pay package twice. First, the $56 billion award, and then the roughly $1 trillion package in late 2025. But just to be clear, guys, the fund doesn't stock pick. Its mandate is to track an index set by the Ministry of Finance. And in the first half of 2026, its tracking error against that benchmark was 33 basis points. So they took a straightforward approach, executed for 30 years without deviation, and beat almost everybody who tried to be clever timing the market. Now, keeping track of something that owns a slice of nearly every company you've ever heard of takes a lot of time and effort. And that's why you should make things easier for yourself by signing up for the Finance Bureau newsletter. It's completely free, and each week we break down capital flows and the policy decisions that actually move your portfolio, so you're always ahead of the curve. Just click the link in the description or scan this QR code on the left of your screen to get started. Right, back to Norway's wealth fund, which by now sounds like a machine that just prints money. But look a little deeper, and there's actually more to it. And that can cause some friction. Norway runs something no other fund of this scale runs, an independent council on ethics established in 2004, which screens the portfolio against guidelines covering human rights, corruption, severe environmental damage, weapons, and tobacco. The council makes its recommendations, and then Norway Bank's executive board decides. And in August 2025, it used that power rather forcefully. The fund fully divested from Caterpillar, where it held a 1.17% stake worth roughly $2.1 billion as of the 30th of June that year. It simultaneously exited 5 Israeli banks, a combined position of about $661 million, nearly $3 billion withdrawn, with the council citing an unacceptable risk that the companies contribute to serious violations of individual rights in situations of war and conflict. And then Norway learned what it costs to have published reasoning. US Senator Lindsey Graham called the decision, quote, beyond offensive and pushed for tariffs and visa restrictions. The White House and State Department declared themselves, quote, very troubled. And on the 4th of November 2025, with the council circling US tech contractors over their cloud arrangements with the Israeli government, the Norwegian parliament voted to suspend the ethical guidelines and pause new exclusion recommendations for roughly a year. Right now, a government-appointed review committee is rewriting the framework entirely. So we don't know yet whether Norway tightens the rules, loosens them, or invents a third category for geopolitically expensive cases. Finance Minister Jens Stoltenberg noted that the 7 largest global companies make up over 15% of the fund's equity portfolio, and that excluding names on that scale would mean, quote, then we would not remain as a broad global index fund, end quote. And that leads me to the major issue Norway's current model is faced with. Because being a broad global index fund is actually what creates a particular piece of risk that Nicolai Tengen can't do anything about. At a Norwegian political festival this August, Tengen had a lot to say about the current structure of the fund's portfolio. On the AI trade and semiconductor complex driving the portfolio, he said, quote, it's chips, 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 chips. We've never seen such concentration before. The top 10 holdings are now somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the entire fund. North American equities are around 57% of the equity portfolio by weight. And US assets across everything the fund owns are over half of the total holdings. NBIM stress testing, reported around that same week, models an AI correction, which is the scenario where all that capital expenditure fails to produce the promised productivity, as a 35% drawdown. On a $2.3 trillion fund, that's about $770 billion. A separate scenario, involving investment restrictions and severe tariffs, models up to 37%. $770 billion is roughly Norway's entire defense budget and all of its hospital spending combined. And what's unusual about this situation is that Tengen can't act on his own warning. As you guys will recall, the benchmark is set by the Ministry of Finance, and changing it requires Parliament, a process that normally takes years. He can't hedge it or tactically trim it. All he can really do is tell people it's there. Tengen said, quote, there is no country in history that over time has managed to hold onto such a large fortune. Fortunes are always lost in the end. Yikes. Now, to be fair, Norway's sovereign wealth fund is much more different than any other entity that has managed to amass anywhere near such massive wealth. The fund has no redemption date and no monthly obligations, and it spends under 3% a year. A 35% paper loss is survivable for an institution like that in a way that it simply isn't for a pension scheme writing checks every single month. However, there is another risk worth quickly mentioning. Sodia projects Norwegian output falling to just under 3.5 million barrels of oil equivalent per day by 2030, with upstream investment dropping from 256 billion kroner this year to about 209 billion kroner by the end of the decade. And that means future growth has to come from returns, not deposits. But having said that, the fund crossed that bridge years ago and barely noticed. So then, why has nobody else replicated this? Well, it isn't scale and it isn't luck. It comes down to three things, and I'll note that they happened in a specific order. 1. The rules were set before the money. Norway's legal institutions, low corruption baseline, and political consensus predated its oil discovery in 1969, so the system was set up by people who had no fortune to fight over yet. 2. The money was sent out of the country. Alaska's permanent fund is the closest American analog, and it does work. But at roughly $80 billion, it sits inside the political economy it serves, which means constant pressure to overdraw for state operating budgets. And 3, the principle was made very hard to touch. 30 years, multiple governments, an oil price crash, a pandemic, and the spending rule only got tightened instead of raided. Norway's fund sits at roughly $2.3 trillion. For a bit of a comparison, China's CIC, Abu Dhabi's ADIA, and Saudi Arabia's PIF each sit somewhere in the region of roughly $0.9 to $1.7 trillion range. And Saudi Arabia has roughly 6 times Norway's population. Norway is not rich because it found oil. It's rich because it decided in advance that finding oil was actually a delicate problem to be managed. It then spent 30 years sticking to a system that turned that oil boom into permanent national wealth. But the fund's greatest strength, its total indifference to what the market is doing this decade, is also the reason its chief executive can only watch an AI concentration risk build and do nothing but talk about it. Patience is the strategy, but it's also kind of the risk at the same time. The strategy that made Norway crazy wealth pretty much boils down to them never trying to outsmart the market. The only fly in the ointment is that if the market is wrong, Norway has to ride all the way down. What do you think? Is Norway destined to go from strength to strength with this foundation of wealth? Or could a major AI correction throw the country into a tailspin? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you want to understand just how much of the global market now rests on the AI capital expenditure cycle that Tengen is so nervous about, then you can check out our video on that right over here. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Nick, signing off.